Hi there, it's Vicki McCarthy from Aussie Stampers. Thank you very much for joining me again today. Today I'll be using 4 colours on my watercolour card: Lost Lagoon, Soft Sky, Baked Brown Sugar and Mossy Meadow. I'm using an aqua painter, a folded paper towel, a post-it note pad and a quarter of a sheet of StampinUp watercolour paper. The stamp set I'm using is In the Meadow. I'm stamping near the top of the post-it notes in Baked Brown Sugar, the image of the 2 deer, and using my paper snips just to cut a mask. And this doesn't have to be exact, it just has to be the general shape around the top of the 2 deer. Leaving the grass, where I'm going to use a green, the Mossy Meadow colour, making sure the sticky part of it is at the top, and then I'm just using the torn off piece to create the grass. In fact, I'll straighten that up now. A little bit straighter. Ready to start. I'm going to use a lot of water to begin with the soft sky colour because I want it nice and light. I'm not wetting the paper first. This is a technique where I want to make sure that the water doesn't run into the masked area. So the best way to ensure that is to start with dry paper and add water with the brush as I go. I'm hoping to achieve a bit of a halo effect around the doe and her fawn by having a really light centre. And you can see I start to flick away from the stamped area as I get further away. And I really aim to get the page reasonably wet so that I can start adding the Lost Lagoon colour in the top and on the sides. I'm not going to let the paper dry between these first 2 coats because I want them to blend in together. So while it's still wet, you can see I've just about used up all of that ink now. I'm bringing in a little of the Lost Lagoon, making sure my brush is wet now. So I squeezed a little bit of water into the brush before I picked up that colour. So I'm working with a nice wet brush on a wet background. So this is really blending easily. And I'm just creating that shadow effect at the top and on the edges, and keeping the centre around the deer nice and light. The light source I have determined is coming from the upper left-hand side. So you'll see as I go through this card that all my colouring and shading will be with the light source on the upper left. And I'm just adding layers. And as with all watercolouring, it's best to be light and then you can always add more rather than going in too dark. So I'm building up that colour so that there's some contrast between the 2 colours, and I'm also blending in the soft sky as I go. Peeling off the mask, and again I want these colours to blend, so I'm using the Mossy Meadow, and this is a really strong colour, which is what I want because I want the base of my art piece to be grounded, literally, so that it's a darker colour. And you can see I'm doing grass-like directions, although the paper is now becoming nice and wet and the ink is moving around really well. And it'll be a more subtle effect as it dries. But I want to make sure that it feels as though there's some weight at the bottom of the page. Now I'm going to take that away and dry it. That's completely dry now. I've dried that with my heat tool, and I'm going to come in and stamp the image with Baked Brown Sugar. And when you're stamping onto watercolour paper, you want to hold the image for a few seconds longer than you normally would because it really needs time to absorb into the paper. Here's the little grass image as well. I'm stamping that with the Baked Brown Sugar. So I'm stamping it once. You'll notice I come in later and stamp it a second time. Now I'm stamping the butterflies and I have immediately regretted it because they seem to be pulling focus from the centerpieces, and I'm really not happy with the size of them. They're just a little bit too big for the right perspective in this, so I've decided already that that's where the sentiment's going to go. So I'll be covering them up later. Now I'm using a very dry brush here. I've wet it, I've changed the colour, and you can see I've wiped it off on my fingers there. So this is a fairly dry brush, and I'm taking a very light touch so that I'm not going to be moving that ink around. It's not a stays on ink, it's not a Memento ink, it's just a regular baked brown sugar pad, and I'm showing you here how you can watercolour without using any of the more permanent inks, just by keeping a really light touch. Now I've decided that I want the dough to be darker than the fawn, because in real life they tend to be darker. The fawns are a much sort of lighter spotty colour. And because she's standing behind the fawn, there will be shadows cast there anyway. And I want the fawn to have those lovely little spots showing on its back. Now I'm taking my time with this, and I'm barely pressing the tip of the aqua painter to the paper. It's barely touching. And that's how it can be such a controlled watercolour effect. I'm following the lines of the stamp, so even though those lines are becoming wet with the ink, because I'm following the lines, I'm not changing the image at all. I'm working with what the artist originally had in mind. And this takes some time because I'm working with a very light touch and a very fine point to the aqua brush. It's the smaller aqua brush. If you have the aqua brushes, you'll notice that one has a finer tip. It comes in packs of 2, and this is the fine tip aqua brush. Now I'm coming back in with the very pale soft sky between the legs of the deer, and I don't want this to be at all dark. I want this actually to be as light as it can be, but still reflect the blue colour, because this is what I mean by almost having a halo around the animals so that you can see they're standing in the light. And really blending that in. You can see I'm flicking it away from the deer because I don't want it to get muddy or contaminated by the baked brown sugar colour. And here I'm coming in with that second piece of grass. Now I've taken that away and it's completely dry now. I've used the heat tool on it. If you didn't want to use your heat tool, you could leave it dry for several hours. Now here's a top tip. This is how I adhere the double-sided tape. I've seen a lot of people sort of slam the tape on and really not take into account that whether it's covering the edges or not. I always send it over the edges, as you can see, and then I bring in my paper snips and I bend that tape back a little bit with my scissors, curl it back so that I've got a perfect edge on all 4 corners now. And that's the weakest part of the card, the corners. So this is going to be a very well secured top piece on the card. You can see I'm using my snips. Be careful if you're doing this because they are very sharp, these paper snips. You could use a paper piercer for the same tool as well, as the same tool, beg your pardon. Now I've already mounted this onto some Lost Lagoon, and the Lost Lagoon card base is folded in half, 14.25 centimetres by 10.5 centimetres. I've layered that onto some corrugated paper, which is 13.5 centimetres by 10 centimetres. Now I'm bringing in a scrap piece of watercolour paper. Never throw these away. You can see I've got it really wet, and I'm using the Mossy Meadow, but it's so wet that it's come out very, very light, which is exactly what I wanted. Now, I don't think I dried this quite fully enough with the heat tool. I think I perhaps could have got a better image with the greeting if I'd let it dry just a little bit more. It's legible, but I think it might have been a bit clearer had I let it dry a little bit more. So I've trimmed that down to make a banner. And now I'm going to cut to the centre and create a little flag on the end. And now I'm just looking at how it's going to adhere on the side of the card. I want that piece underneath to pop up on some dimensionals. So I'm going to cut a strip from the very edge of the dimensionals and just pop that under that piece. And I've moved it to the top above those butterflies, which were really not something that I wanted to see. And I'm glad that I did that, because I think finishing it off with the piece of linen thread, which I've wound around 3 times, really works. I hope you enjoyed that today. I'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye for now.